Welcome to Deep Dive. Today, we're setting our sights on a place whose story is, well, far bigger than its small landmass suggests, the Marshall Islands.
Absolutely. It's a corner of the world with just an incredible history, ancient knowledge that still resonates today.
And challenges that really speak to some of the biggest issues facing our planet.
And we've got a fantastic resource to guide us through it all. We're working from a detailed document titled A Brief History of Marshall Islands by Associate Professor Dr. Afisavadchaya Sirivadanawaravachara.
That gives us a really rich foundation, doesn't it? Takes us from the earliest days of Pacific voyaging right up to, well, the complexities of modern life there.
Right. And our mission really is to unpack all of this material for you. We want to pull out the key insights, uncover some perhaps surprising facts, and, connect the dots across centuries of change.
From those amazing ancient navigational skills
Yeah, incredible stuff.
to the very real impacts of climate change and that complex, difficult nuclear legacy.
It's a vital story.
And by the end of this deep dive, we hope you'll have a much better understanding of why this particular nation matters so much.
Think of us as your guides through this material, helping you see what's truly important, what's impactful.
All right, let's unpack this. First off, just getting our bearings, geographically speaking. The Marshall Islands aren't, a solid landmass you can easily point to on a map.
No, exactly. They're a massive, sprawling archipelago way out there in the North Pacific Ocean.
We're talking about a vast ocean area, right? Over 2 million square kilometers.
Huge, dotted with more than 1,000 islands and islets. Specifically, the source breaks it down as 29 atolls and 5 isolated islands.
And what makes it truly unique, as the source highlights, is that it's fundamentally a nation of atolls. What does that actually mean for the people living there?
Well, it means the land is incredibly fundamentally low-lying. The highest points are just tiny coral rims. On Majuro, you might get maybe 10 to 20 feet high.
Wow.
But elsewhere, it's even lower, like 16 feet on Ailing Laplap or a mere 6.5 feet on Wutchie.
So that low elevation has huge defining implications.
Oh, absolutely critical ones. It means extreme susceptibility to flooding, whether from tides or storms.
Right.
And because atolls don't have rivers or streams, even freshwater runoff just collects and can flood streets.
So it severely limits where you can live, where you can farm.
Exactly. The source notes agriculture happens in soils less than 2.5 feet above sea level, and habitations are basically right at ground level. There's just very little room for retreat when the water comes up.
The source lists some key atolls you might have heard of: Bikini, Enuitak, Kwajalein, Majuro.
Familiar names. Unfortunately, often for tragic reasons.
It also mentions 2 submerged reefs and 5 true islands. And interestingly, Majuro and Mili are listed in the source as both an atoll and an island.
Right, which kind of highlights the unique geological formations these places represent. They blur the lines sometimes.
And getting around within this nation sounds like a significant challenge itself.
Definitely. Majuro and Ibai hold the majority of the population.
Majuro is the main shipping point, but Ibai, it's closed to ship traffic.
Yes, close to ships. It relies instead on air transport, mostly to and from Majuro.
So flights to other islands mainly connect through Majuro too.
Mostly, yeah, with only limited exceptions from Kwajalein.
And the source points out there's no inter-island ferry system.
No, which really underscores the logistical hurdles. Connecting communities spread across such a huge area of ocean, it's tough.
Okay, so tracing the story way back, thousands of years,
Right.
Who were the first people to call these low-lying atolls home?
The Marshallese people. They have an incredibly deep history on these islands, stretching back millennia.
And the leading theory about their origins, where did they come from?
The prevailing idea, based on the material we have, is that they descend from Austronesian peoples. These groups migrated from island Southeast Asia, reaching Micronesia around 2000 BC.
Okay.
The ancestors of the Marshallese seem to have branched off later, maybe between 1000 BC and 200 AD, traveling southeast through the Caroline Islands.
And their language fits into that broader Micronesian branch of Pacific languages.
Correct.
But what really stands out from the source, I think, is the sophistication of their traditional navigational knowledge.
Oh, this is where the deep history is particularly stunning, just incredible. The source describes their navigation as exceptionally sophisticated. It wasn't just stars,
Right.
It was built on this intricate understanding of the relationships between islands, the patterns of ocean waves, swells, currents, wind.
Wow.
It even suggests these techniques might have been developed prior to some of the perhaps better-known Melanesian voyaging techniques.
That's fascinating. It really challenges some common narratives about Pacific exploration, doesn't it?
It does. Suggests a unique, maybe even older tradition of sophisticated voyaging right there in that part of the Pacific.
Raises important questions about the diversity and the depth of ancient Pacific knowledge systems.
Exactly.
The source also gives us these glimpses into the atolls before European contact. Some were uninhabited, others apparently densely populated.
Right. And there's this remarkable oral tradition mentioned about how the current ownership of the northern atolls came about.
Ah, yes, the Great War.
Yeah. Apparently resolved not by more fighting, but by a peaceful game.
A game.
A game. And the atolls were divided according to the outcome. The source notes this agreement lasted to this day.
Incredible. That really highlights the power and longevity of their oral histories, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Passed down through generations, recorded in local traditions from places like Inutak, Ujjayi, Utrik, Kwajalein, sometimes even linking inhabitants to mythical groups like the family of doves.
So moving forward in time, when did Europeans first arrive on the scene?
Well, the first European sighting is thought to be in 1526.
Okay.
By the Spanish navigator Alonso de Salazar on the Florentina. He apparently encountered some difficulties.
Right. There were later sightings near Mili, presumed mapping by the Spanish?
Correct, but direct contact seems to have happened a bit later, mid-16th century. Again, likely Spanish navigators.
The source mentions Pero de Unamuno in 1565.
Yes, who drew a chart that seems to correspond to the islands, noting an Isla de las Velas Latinas, which might refer to Chile.
And the first European to actually step foot on one of the islands.
That seems to be Alvaro de Mendaña de Nera in 1595. He landed near what is present-day Namu, although the source says the exact island isn't determined.
So Spanish presence continued, mentions of King Philip II, Roger de Pinto's expedition.
Yes, and despite later sightings by others like the Dutch explorer Thomas Comar in 1616, Spanish maritime control seems to have persisted, documented through various explorer accounts.
And here's where the source offers a really interesting perspective.
Yeah, this is fascinating. It suggests the Marshallese didn't initially feel the loss of contact too keenly.
Really? How so?
They seem to have integrated the European ships into their existing cultural framework. They even interpreted the appearance of Spanish authority through the lens of their own mythical beliefs about spirits and voyages.
That's a key insight, isn't it? It tells us the first encounters weren't necessarily perceived by the Marshallese as, an immediate imposition of foreign power.
Right. They filtered it, made sense of it within their established worldview.
It's a reminder that history isn't just a one-sided narrative.
Definitely not.
Okay, fast forward a few centuries, and European interest shifts dramatically.
Yes, you see a big change. From relative neglect, maybe because the arid coral environment didn't initially scream riches to Europeans,
Right.
to the islands becoming, as the source puts it, a bustling center of commerce by the late 1870s.
What drove that transformation? What changed?
Copra, the rise of copra production. This led to commercial renegotiation, foreign firms reclaiming land, and German firms formalizing their presence by 1883. Protestant missionaries also arrived around this time, alongside those commercial interests.
The source presents this fascinating, almost contradictory view Europeans held of the islands and people during this period.
It really does. They were simultaneously seen as blighted and blessed, a failed Eden and a potential bonanza.
Huh. So negative characterizations alongside potential wealth.
Exactly. You get descriptions like idling canoers, algal miners, people deemed unfit for good governance. But then contrasted with descriptions of natural wealth, incredibly tall palms, huge sharks, tortoises, fabled fish sizes.
Interesting. The source even notes that failed attempts by some firms might reflect this negative bias or misunderstanding, not necessarily that the islands lacked potential.
Right. It suggests the European perspective might have been skewed.
And by 1886, German colonization was complete.
Yes, their presence became quite formal. German language used for senior administration, German stamps, trade consuls. The source colorfully notes, dozen little German flags fluttered.
And how was their administration characterized in the source? Good, bad?
It's described, perhaps surprisingly, as ruling well and acceptable by island standards, with precautions intelligently taken to avert native revolt, often using mobile vessels and corvettes for control.
Okay. Then, after World War I, the global power dynamics shifted again.
Right. Under the League of Nations mandate system, Japan took control of Germany's Pacific possessions.
The idea being that advanced nations would oversee backward colonies?
That was the theory.
Right.
But the source notes Japan's relationship with the League was strained from the start.
They were required to comply, but they refused one key rule, something about an adult-only rule in Micronesia.
Yes, claiming it was an internal affair. That, coupled with external pressures like the Great Depression in the 1930s, which forced Japan onto a strict gold standard, it put pressure on their mandate.
Right. And the source notes that post-WWI, Japan increasingly adopted militarism and imperialism,
Eventually withdrawing from the League in 1933.
which left the mandated area vulnerable.
Yeah. The source says Japan began making inroads towards the continent, though initially the mandate itself carried an impression of peaceful rule, focusing on security.
The Pacific War was later depicted defensively, right?
Yes. Their first government orders in 1919 proclaimed peace-building, infrastructure, prioritizing public security, while also suppressing socialists. It sort of set the stage.
It set the stage for the dramatic changes to come.
Absolutely.
Then came World War II, and the impact on the Marshall Islands was, according to the source, just devastating.
The source uses incredibly powerful language. It describes an avalanche of misery.
The islands became a critical strategic point for Japan.
Hugely critical. Air bases on the 3 main islands, a massive influx of ships, planes, an estimated 8,000 troops and laborers bringing war supplies. It completely transformed the place.
Initially, the source describes this strange spectacle, though, soldiers being friendly, colorful scenes.
Yeah, you see these initial descriptions. Colorful kimonos, young women, trucks, charts changing, flowers, close contact with people. Neighboring islands found themselves batty, which probably means overwhelmed or confused by the sudden transformation.
But then things turned terrible. The source calls it remarkable cruelty.
The descriptions are difficult to read, honestly. The source recounts witnessing an officer pouring boiling water on structures, animals, and men, followed by gunfire, described chillingly as testing completed.
Horrifying.
It mentions an infant mortuary, rats, a monstrous whirring engine, and the destruction being swift and certain.
Planes dropping bombs, described visually as crimson, then quickly followed, suggesting blood.
That seems likely, yes. Fields and waterways sucked it up.
And the climax, 3 times more fierce.
Yes. Greater temples burned, waves mimicking an earthquake, deep red looting, cluster bombs, death from mortars and bombs, decimating docks, seas splitting upwards, oily teardrops, rainbows over shattered crosspieces. It's a vivid, horrifying account of the direct experience of war on the islands.
After the war, control shifted yet again, this time to the United States.
Correct. The islands that were under Japan came under U.S. control as a post-war trustee, under the United Nations system, initially administered by the U.S. Navy.
Responsibility was later handed over to the Department of the Interior in 1951, and they seem to have viewed the islands with a kind of dual perspective.
That's right. Potential U.S. territories, but also seen as underdeveloped nations needing guidance.
And critically, it was at this very moment that the United States resumed nuclear testing in the Pacific.
Precisely. And specifically choosing the Marshall Islands as the site.
The source points out a crucial error in planning here, a terrible assumption.
Yeah. U.S. planners apparently assumed no islanders would be left on the planned test atolls, Bikini and Inuitak. But research ships arriving found local people still living there.
Leading to forced relocations, the source details these.
Yes. For Bikini Atoll, fishermen, seamen, and their families were moved to Rongerik Atoll.
And Inuitak.
Islanders there were initially moved to Ujalang. But because their original island was slated to be essentially blown up and made uninhabitable, they were later moved again, back to Inuitak, but to a different island about 500 miles away, which had limited resources.
And their original land was confiscated.
Confiscated for return, yes. The source also mentions the Cowers swiftly moved from an abandoned village to Kili, 900 miles away, becoming, according to the source, fully reliant on imported goods. Just devastating displacement.
So the U.S. controlled the Marshall Islands under the trust territory of the Pacific Islands system.
Right. The source mentions other proposals were floated like more effective administration, or maybe joining a U.S. Commonwealth like Palau or the Northern Marianas.
But those were thwarted by an unyielding Congress, according to the source.
Yes. And the Marshall Islands were represented during this time by a notable figure, Lejeune St. Aquiner.
Described as profoundly respected but anachronistic.
Yes, half Samoan, half Marshallese, and noted for wearing a long skirt even in the U.S. Senate, a small detail that highlights the blend of cultures and the challenges of navigating those international political spaces.
With all this history unfolding, the idea of self-government began to grow stronger after WWII.
Understandably, nationalism was emerging across the Pacific, and the Marshallese people increasingly saw self-governance as, well, inevitable.
They looked to pro-independence movements elsewhere, like Hawaii and American Samoa, for lessons.
Right. There were even discussions in the 1960s about changing the name of the islands, some suggesting John Marshall Island, after the U.S. Chief Justice.
And here's where the source highlights a really significant moment. Marshallese students attending an archaeological symposium in Mexico in 1969.
Yes, this seems to have been pivotal.
They met Felipe Garcia, a pro-independence youth leader from Mexico.
And according to the source, this meeting sparked a crucial realization. One Marshallese woman recounted understanding their situation wasn't directly comparable to Mexico's. But the discussion led to this powerful, if perhaps cynical, idea that pursuing independence as the only legitimate form of self-government might actually win more attention and punishment from the U.S.
That's a pretty stark assessment from the source, but it marked a shift in thinking.
It seemed to. It changed perspectives. The source notes their previous disdain for other islanders changed, and many students began talking seriously about independence after that.
Leading up to the 1979 elections, political parties started forming.
Initially, three main groups. Pro-independence, those favoring a sweetheart deal with the U.S., and the undecided.
And the pro-sweetheart deal group formed the United Democratic Party, the UDP.
Correct. Emphasizing economic unions and, as the source puts it, characterizing the independentistas as malcontents and bloody-minded. Strong language.
This growing independence movement then became deeply intertwined with the ongoing nuclear testing concerns.
Absolutely linked. By 1961, protests were already underway, fueled by those concerns.
A significant moment was in August 1970.
Yes, when over 1,000 islanders on Majuro sent an official petition to the U.S. government demanding an end to testing and calling for peaceful solutions.
There were people's demonstrations in March 1970, and formal action followed another protest in March 1971.
And this led to a truly dramatic act of defiance. Just incredible bravery.
What happened?
Islanders borrowed a traditional outrigger canoe, the small bananas, and paddled 14 miles directly into the U.S. nuclear test zone.
Into the zone?
Yes. They landed on Moser Island, an island which, just 4 days earlier, a U.S. scientist had deemed uninhabited and free of any radiation contamination.
Wow. And they stayed there?
They spent 48 hours setting up camp.
Until
the helicopter arrived carrying Captain Edward B. Murphy and 6 Atomic Energy Commission officers.
And the U.S. response?
Captain Murphy delivered a formal message summoning all native men ashore and warned that unless they left or stayed put as instructed, the U.S. government would evict them via force.
So, direct confrontation.
Very direct. While the source notes reconciliation occurred later, mentioning September 1963, though the chronology seems off compared to the 1971 protest, so we stick to the source detail. The significance of these events is clear.
How so?
Oral history captured the uproar, the specific language used in these encounters. The source states these events would forever alter the political terrain.
Shifting the dynamic.
Exactly. Towards negotiating treaties instead of just maintaining trusts. And raising crucial questions about protecting the islanders' cultural heritage in the face of these external powers.
This whole history then leads directly to the Compact of Free Association.
Yes. Signed in 1986 after 5 years of intense negotiation between the U.S. and the Marshall Islands.
It's a 17-section document governing their political and financial relationship. Took effect in October 86 after U.S. Congress ratified it.
And the source classifies the Marshall Islands under this agreement as reassociations.
So what are the key provisions?
Under the compact, the U.S. agreed to provide substantial financial assistance. The source notes this averaged over $100 million annually, totaling over $850 million by mid-2008.
A huge amount.
Significant funding. In return, the U.S. retained responsibility for defense.
But relinquished authority over foreign affairs, land use, resource use, economic development.
Correct. That authority shifted to the RMI government.
The structure involves joint control, national elections.
Yes. Though the source mentions that while the compact theoretically allows the Marshall Islands to oppose U.S. actions or for the U.S. to re-examine jurisdictions, actually exercising these options is difficult for the Marshall Islands before the U.S. Congress. There's a power imbalance.
And the economic assistance was tied to a detailed development plan.
Yes, with over $206 million mentioned specifically for priority programs. However, the source adds a crucial point. The assistance provisions under the new compact became more complicated and restrictively indeterminate than before.
E-name.
Tighter constraints on the compacted government's activities compared to previous arrangements. Less flexibility, perhaps.
The diplomatic relationship framework under the compact is described as one of mutual respect and security.
Right, with ongoing consultation via joint committee.
And here's that specific point highlighted in the source again, which seems potentially contradictory to standard international recognition, but we report what the source says.
Yes, it states the U.S. is the only nation to recognize RMI and is responsible for its defense. This is presented in the source as the framework established by the compact agreement itself.
Okay. Recent relations, as of the source's publication around mid-2008, how were they?
They began with relatively low tension after the 2004 arrangement kicked in through about 2006.
But there were disagreements.
Periodic disagreements, yeah, over budget and inflation adjustments. Disputes over unspent funds were apparently resolved in 2007.
And hopes were high for exchange visits in mid-2008.
Yes, and the opening of embassies in 2006, RMI's ambassador to the U.S., a U.S. special envoy that seemed to help improve relations.
Okay, let's step back from the political timeline for a moment and talk about culture. The source describes a really rich cultural heritage.
Absolutely, a source of pride stretching back thousands of years. With a population around 60,000, half living in an area the size of California, the source implies a significant density in the inhabited areas where culture is vibrant.
And family and kinship are absolutely central.
Huge. Vast families, large kinship circles, individuals often having many names. Traditional clan structures remain important, and kinship is vital for maintaining social harmony.
Society has been traditionally stratified, chiefly rule.
Yes, and those expectations towards authority still persist, though in changed forms. Traditional ceremonial cycles, the relationships between chiefs and commoners, these heavily influenced clan structure and succession.
And there were traditional control methods.
Councils, clan discipline, traditional control over movement and wealth, yes.
Housing was traditionally communal.
Right. Houses built around a central courtyard used for everything, meetings, rest, kitchen, entertainment, even a shrine.
And knowledge transmission was deeply embedded in tradition.
Very much so. The source mentions the elderly informing adolescent girls before menstruation to prevent clan disruption, and early instruction in village etiquette being vital for boys before they interacted with higher authorities. Really specific cultural practices.
Modern life, especially on eBay, has developed its own distinct culture mixing elements.
Yes, but there's also a conscious effort mentioned to keep Marshallese time, meaning speaking the native tongue, maintaining those connections.
Traditional arts, historically the province of men, are highlighted too. Carvings?
Yeah, carvings from wood, shells, stone, bone, plant fibers, creating intricate patterns for both ornamental and practical objects, like canoe sails and fish hooks.
The design of those traditional canoe sails is singled out as particularly significant.
It is. The source describes it as a real matter of competence and style. Sailors fashioned and embellished their own.
It needed to be effective, obviously, but also
bespeak the Holy Spirit's bounty and be beautiful in a way that was almost barely noticeable, subtly concealing the creator's imperfections. A really nuanced aesthetic.
The source does point to a decline in some traditional practices, though, like using those small one- or two-man boats.
Yes. The pawpaw, made from coconut and palm fronds, used for food gathering and fishing, and a loss of the skills associated with using them, preparing coconut.
It also touches on changes in traditional food. Still a point of pride, but imported food has changed things.
It has, leading to that slightly unusual, perhaps strangely worded detail in the source about beef being raised on jelly bean and mutton on tomato jam. We report it as it's written.
Definitely unusual. A fascinating tradition highlighted is EO in book.
Ah, yes, this is really interesting. It's a long-standing practice for remembering personal histories by recounting genealogy.
The name means walking on someone else's path.
Exactly, from eat or eek, meaning to walk. It involves blending historical remarks with the genealogical line.
And senior chiefs or kings typically tell these histories.
That's right. With the genealogies of minor chiefs becoming perhaps less detailed over generations, chiefly rank is even compared poetically to Eben, the Haida Sickle period.
Slighted genealogies can be complemented by historical notes. The concept is about telling this history into eternity.
but the source points out some real complexities and maybe even contradictions.
Like what?
Well, it's strict for chiefs defending their rank, not to forget genealogy. Less so for commoners, the Vanu. But then there's this paradox mentioned. A genealogist must record this for the community, which simultaneously forbids members from knowing their genealogy.
That's complex.
Very. Knowledge is divulged apparently with a generous donation of notes. Offspring are trained from toddler age to memorize and present verbatim.
It can be informal for some chiefs seeking to protect their rank.
Yes, and chiefs at leisure might forget older genealogies. The source even mentions merging stories, like a skateboard story, a strange detail that perhaps illustrates how these oral histories adapt. Maybe blending modern elements to protect sensitive information or disguise locations and names.
So foreign history only matters when it's relevant to the main narrative.
Pretty much only when the vehicle is established, as the source puts it. Island groups even compete for certain motifs in these tellings. It paints a picture of a complex, living, adapting tradition.
Absolutely. The source also covers art and literature. Reiterating traditional art is primarily men's carving work.
Right. But it delves more deeply into oral literature, describing it as a truly living tradition. Poets are often near the political center, engaging directly with contemporary events, the nuclear question, border rights, power struggles.
And the act is a key element here.
Yes, a form of poetic delivery where the recipient responds in kind. It's used in negotiations, even threats related to political issues.
The structure sounds intricate.
Very. Parsed into rhetorical sequences, images, dualities, puns, properties, metaphors, crafted polygenetically through a chain of poets across time.
And crucially, it's about performance.
Absolutely essential. It's recited with prosody, gesture, music, verbal art. You can't understand it just by roting it quietly. It's always an engagement with performance registers, agents, speech acts, the event itself.
Written literature is a more recent development for the RMI.
Much more recent. The first published book mentioned was a portfolio of photos with text. Other publications include research articles, newsletters, a journal.
And there's an effort now to collect traditional stories.
Yes. Attention is turning to collecting and transcribing traditional myths and stories before they are lost, specifically for a Marshallese audience. The source also mentions a past effort, a 1959 writing competition, to help students get accustomed to the written word.
Turning now to the economy, the source describes it as being in transition, a difficult one.
Very much so. Grappling with the economic freedom gained from the compact, but also adjusting to the reduction or loss of that U.S. subsidy.
Opening the doors to finance and business allowed for diversification.
Yes, but according to the source, it also meant a loss of control over domestic policies.
This led to that period of unprecedented growth in the 1990s, mostly speculation.
Largely fueled by speculation in international business, yes.
And the consequence when that ended was dramatic.
A massive economic contraction, described by the source as happening almost overnight and being one of the largest anywhere in the world, a huge shock to the system.
The public sector still makes up a large part of the economy.
About 66%, yes. But its size, responsibility, and control are reducing, which increases market pressures. Development plans have been put in place to try and regain growth and ensure sustainability, protecting against future shocks.
Tourism development is mentioned as part of this effort.
Right, the Paper Eye program, aiming to develop a multifaceted tourism industry.
A private pilot program started in 2000.
Yes, and it has grown with government support, meeting to hotels, restaurants, and even the country's first successful small cruise industry, according to the source.
Let's look a little more closely at those tourism efforts. They've been ongoing since 1991.
There's a comprehensive planned tourism policy, individual enterprise plans, a lot of planning.
But the source notes growth hasn't really met expectations.
No, not despite the facilities being put in place. Challenges remain attracting sufficient airlines, securing enough promotional investment, adequate visitor accommodations.
Various agencies and groups are involved. And a 1996 study identified specific areas where assistance was needed.
Exactly. Things like identifying products and markets, developing a marketing plan, staff training, promotional programs, research and monitoring, and establishing a tourism board for better coordination.
Visitor trends show growth in airline arrivals since 91, with a dip in 93.
Right. But the majority of tourists are still coming for business purposes.
Visiting friends, conferences, sports are also significant factors.
But strikingly, less than 1% come specifically for ecotourism.
Despite the source noting considerable scope for natural, cultural, and historical tourism development if properly promoted.
Yeah. There's clearly potential there that hasn't been fully tapped yet.
Now, the environmental challenges. These are profound for a low-lying atoll nation like the Marshall Islands.
They really are. These are challenges common across many low-lying Pacific Island nations, stemming directly from their incredibly vulnerable geography.
The risks listed in the source are serious. Sea level rise, obviously, habitat loss.
Coastal inundation and flooding, increased frequency and severity of cyclones, decreased food security from declining agricultural land, and saltwater intrusion.
And ocean pollution.
Yes. But the most immediate, the most existential threat is the loss of land due to sea level rise.
Because the total land area is just so small, 181.4 square kilometers, and the elevation so low.
There's simply little room for retreat, as the source puts it.
Previous studies predicted significant land loss, 10–20% in the next 50 years.
That's what some studies suggested, and the source notes that the population being spread out but unconcentrated on the 23 inhabited islands actually exacerbates this vulnerability.
But the source also introduces a crucial layer of complexity here. It's not just a simple disappearing islands scenario.
Right. It argues that model doesn't account for everything. Variables like oceanic currents, upwelling, even El Niño and La Niña can decouple global sea level rise from local relative sea level changes. It's more complicated.
And here's where the source offers a potential point of hope.
Yes, it suggests that well-maintained islands can grow vertically through natural processes.
Like sedimentation, reef growth.
Exactly. Terrestrial addition, too. These responses, the source notes, have actually been observed, and they offer hope for the future.
But it's cautious hope.
Very cautious. It immediately tempers this by emphasizing the significant uncertainty, stating flatly that a great deal that is not known about the future of sea level and the ocean near the RMI. So, hope, but huge unknowns remain.
Moving to the nuclear legacy. This is such a defining, difficult chapter in the Marshall Islands story.
Absolutely unavoidable.
Yeah.
The source identifies the Marshall Islands as the setting of a nuclear legacy nearing its 70th year. One of the earliest test sites, potential victims after WWII.
And it notes a lack of attention paid to the nuclear oral history, the history itself.
Yeah, suggesting it's been somewhat overlooked or suppressed.
The source presents the U.S. motivation quite directly.
Stemming from its post-WWII monopoly on the atomic bomb, its efforts to keep it, and develop the hydrogen bomb, which required open-air tests.
And it states the U.S. acquired the islands through stealthy, coercive means to find a suitable testing venue. Strong words.
Very strong words from the source, yes.
The testing period ran from 1946 to 1958. 65 atmospheric tests, 2 underground.
And the source points out that islands not originally designated as ground zeros were also impacted, creating these unknown ground zero islands. The effects spread.
The scale of the U.S. testing is characterized powerfully by the source,
calling the bomb tests the largest single, fully realized military operation in American history up to that point.
Yet, according to the source, the purpose remained obscure to the local people themselves.
They didn't necessarily know why this was happening to their home.
Fallout was a major, devastating consequence.
Huge. The 1946 Bikini test was visually spectacular, apparently, but the ash spread far beyond the planned area, falling on Aluk and other eastern atolls.
And the source stresses this fallout received little attention. Local accounts ignored.
Yes, local oral history about fallout incidents was banned, dismissed, and ignored.
The source uses very powerful language again to characterize U.S. actions related to the testing.
Extremely strong. It describes the displacement and relocation policies as uniquely the unprecedented and unremediated stealthy violence of the transnational state.
And frames the entire legacy as a process of nuclear colonialism.
Yes, where militarism prohibited civilian access to fallout areas and nuclear hegemony suppressed criticism of the geomanipulation involved.
It suggests invisible fallout catastrophes reinterpret cultural ecology in the face of a militarized state.
And it calls for a multi-angled exposition to reveal the consequences, arguing this is needed to counter transnational state secrecy and a militarized media. These are very pointed perspectives presented directly from the source material we're examining.
Okay, let's turn to education and literacy. The source describes a significant transformation here over time.
A huge shift. From a very minor role historically, education became something entirely new and much more widespread, largely due to the U.S. presence.
From maybe one small grass shack school.
With only a fraction of children attending, yes, to a network of over 70 buildings and hundreds of teachers. A massive expansion.
Control shifted to the RMI government after the trust territory dissolved. They now run most schools.
Yes, over 85 elementary and secondary schools. Churches run about a dozen preschools. And the source notes schools are improving with external funding, new buildings, desks, textbooks.
There have been some impressive achievements in access.
Definitely. Elementary enrollment climbed dramatically from around 1,000 maybe to over 8,000. The number of schools increased. 8 government systems across the islands.
Community classrooms with the Marshallese-only curriculum.
Established, yes. The number of classrooms almost doubled. Over 200 elementary teachers employed. Real growth.
And non-government education is also quite significant.
Very. Churches run K elementary and high schools, and non-church organizations provide preschool and vocational training. Total enrollment across all systems is around 86% of age-eligible children. Pretty high coverage.
But there's been a notable shift in the language used in education, particularly after the trust territory period ended.
A very significant shift. Under the U.S. administration, Marshallese was the primary language in elementary schools.
Yeah.
Attendance was mandated, parent education was provided.
But post-1986, under RMI government control,
Marshallese ceased being the priority language in high schools. English became dominant.
and this coincided with many Marshallese emigrating to the U.S.
Yes, often seeking higher education and employment opportunities where English was seen as key.
The source points out that this near-universal belief that English is the language of opportunity makes high school attendance almost mandatory across the islands now.
Right. Even though children still hear Marshallese at home, on the street, often in elementary school, the linguistic environment is changing rapidly.
Due to mass media?
Primarily, yes. The source mentions an explosion of television access, movie theaters, the internet, and even a decrease in the Marshallese newspaper presence. English is everywhere.
This is leading to what the source calls linguistic hybridization.
Yeah. The speech of school children is changing fast, marked by borrowed English words, influences from the host language's rules.
The source notes that this English lexified speech seems to lack grammar in the view of some elders.
Yes, and elder Marshallese often find these innovations incomprehensible. There's a generational language gap emerging.
So the core issue highlighted is that Marshallese itself is increasingly viewed as declining, struggling to convey contemporary meanings.
Exactly, which makes language and identity critical issues for Marshallese people, both in the islands and for those living abroad. It's about more than just communication.
Looking at the modern political landscape, the formal move to self-governance began in May 1979.
Yes, with a constitutional convention elected and a new constitution voted on in July.
The RMI joined the ranks of other self-governing atoll nations seeking assistance from major powers.
Right, whether for military security, economic support, or social development. They adopted a new flag, U.S. consulates closed, new embassies opened, the national government was established. The structures of statehood.
And the Compact of Free Association, formally ratified in September 1986, brought into force that period where the U.S. retained defense but relinquished control over other key areas.
Yes. Foreign affairs, land resource use, economic development that shifted to the RMI.
The source contextualizes the establishment of the RMI Elon in Marshallese as relatively recent, viewed against that long backdrop of colonial and trust administrations.
Right. It didn't just appear out of nowhere.
And it notes external influences, like Christianity, as being the most important and far-reaching influence on traditional life.
Alongside increased contact with Western ideas, customs, practices under colonial rule, all shaping the modern context, these external influences created the backdrop for the modern state.
Internationally, the RMI seems quite active, being a member of numerous intergovernmental organizations.
Yes, the list is long. UN, WHO, IMF, World Bank Group, ADB, UNESCO, the Pacific Islands Forum Fisheries Agency, FFA, the Pacific Community, PRP, many others.
It's designated a Pacific Small Islands state.
And maintains relations of mutual respect and cooperation with the UN, which recognizes the importance of the compact.
The source mentions some past issues, though. Suspension from the Pacific Islands Forum.
Yes, in 1998, apparently for non-payment of dues, and its membership in SPR-FMO, though adherence to the 2009 convention wasn't confirmed in the document we have. So some bumps in the road internationally.
We touched on the relationship with the U.S. under the compact already, the framework for the political relationship and economic assistance.
Right. Emphasizing mutual respect, security, ongoing consultation via the Joint Committee. And again, that's source statement. The U.S. is the only nation recognizing RMI and responsible for its defense under the compact's terms.
Since the 1986 compact, over $850 million in U.S. federal assistance transferred up to mid-2008.
As we noted, significant funding.
The current arrangement from 2004 started with relatively low tension through 2006. Periodic disagreements over budget inflation, disputes resolved in 2007, hopes for exchange visits, improved relations via embassies opening around mid-2008.
So, an ongoing complex relationship defined by that compact.
Finally, let's look at the future prospects and challenges outlined in the source. It's framed as facing profound challenges.
That seems understated, perhaps? These challenges, the source notes, require firm, sound, representative, transparent political and community leadership. A tall order.
Key challenges listed are climate change, obviously, the ongoing nuclear concerns,
And population well-being, including growth, the aspirations of the youth, migration patterns.
The source does acknowledge progress has been made over the last 25 years of assistance.
Yes, building a political and bureaucratic structure with some capacity to act. And it notes that Marshallese traditions and systems themselves hold valuable insights and tools for facing these challenges.
But it stresses that extensive further work and resources are needed.
Desperately needed. To complete what's been started, extend development processes, and address an anticipated flood of new projects, concerns, and problems. It sounds overwhelming.
The most important element for the future, according to the source,
The people themselves, their integrity, commitment, focus on the collective good.
it highlights the need for leaders who can synthesize vision, values, understanding, knowledge, insight into compelling outcomes.
And translate them into achievement with commitment, integrity, decisiveness, skill. It's a high bar for leadership.
The source notes the collective dream needs to be held in common, backed by sacrifice and effort, recalling how past promises of external support have often faded. A cautionary note there.
Very much so. Don't rely solely on outside help.
While opportunities and resources aren't lacking, even assertions of generosity that seems almost too good to be true are mentioned.
The challenge lies in honestly appraising the integrity and limits of those offers. Systems are needed for that.
The source lists several significant challenges specifically for the future: environmental and food security.
Threats from climate change, overfishing, pollution, huge issues.
Governance issues.
Political fragmentation, a crowded party system prone to decline, the ever-present risk of corruption undermining sustainable development,
And population issues.
the drift to the U.S. risking the cultural future, denser migration to Majuro and Ibai creating environmental stress, and the specter of a demographic crisis potentially risking national collapse. Stark warnings. The COVID-19 pandemic in late 2020 added additional economic stress on top of all this. Right. While safety net programs helped households, cuts to the crucial tuna fishery and public high school spending hurt others.
Excess funds flowed into an offshore development bank, easing transition somewhat.
But the source notes the end of the compact funding isn't zero-sum. There are competing demands for cash, high adaptation costs, fewer fishing vessels, a changing workforce. It makes fisheries tougher.
And leasing fishing rights without underlying development just deepens poverty elsewhere.
A complex economic trap. Specific resource management needs include managing overfishing, opening markets for traded rights, complicated by invasive species.
Pressures from managing high seas fishery policies, stock levels.
Also huge challenges, alongside almost non-existent on-land management for garbage, toxins, plastic pollution, basic infrastructure needs.
And finally, a challenge is the need to better manage, maybe reduce expectations of foreign services provision, become more self-reliant.
It's clear the path ahead is incredibly complex and demanding. But the source does note the capacity and tradition are there to meet it, if harnessed effectively.
So we've journeyed through this deep history and the modern challenges in the Marshall Islands, uncovering a remarkable mix of cultural resilience, geographic vulnerability, economic transition, political development, environmental threats. It's a lot.
It really is. And the island's importance and influence on global history, from ancient voyaging to the nuclear age and now the forefront of climate change impacts, it's just astounding for such a physically small nation.
It's a place with a truly unique way of life stretching back thousands of years. Those incredible traditional sails, the Fanfikar, described as engineering marvels.
And unique historical artifacts like the Ghost Islands, remnants of Mobile Base, 1950s Cold War history you won't find elsewhere. Layers upon layers.
While acknowledging the difficult, devastating consequences of colonization and past actions, the source reminds us nobody is innocent in these complex histories.
A sobering thought.
The lessons feel clear, though. The source suggests the trials and tribulations of the Marshallese should remind today's world leaders of their fallibility.
That people's well-being must always come first. And finding new energy sources is critical globally, something the islands are acutely, existentially aware of.
And on global issues like sea level rise, which the source highlights, is still uncertain in its precise local effects, but undeniably a major threat.
It argues humanity needs preventative measures now, not just waiting passively to see what happens. Action is needed.
The source leaves us with a powerful final thought. History is an unfinished story.
Meeting a sequel, it says, perhaps even a shadow state. It suggests that learning from people shapes the world, that searching can be painful, but spontaneous travel or inquiry can bring advantages.
And crucially, that history isn't meant to just sit inertly in a bookshelf.
No, it needs to be actively shared, archived, wrigglingly on a channel. As the source colorfully, memorably puts it, history is alive.
Reflecting on everything we've covered in this deep dive, from those ancient navigators, through colonialism, the nuclear legacy, to the current fight against climate change and economic challenges, the depth and the resilience of the Marshall Islands story is truly striking.
It really underscores how interconnected our global histories are, and the critical importance of understanding the perspectives and challenges faced by communities often overlooked on the world stage. Their stories are our stories too, in many ways.
And that final thought from the source really resonates. History is an unfinished story. What does that mean for you, for us, as we look at the future? The lessons from places like the Marshall Islands about leadership, adaptation, the consequences of global actions, the sheer importance of cultural resilience, they feel absolutely vital for the story that is still unfolding right now.
It definitely challenges us to actively engage with these histories, these ongoing stories, and consider our own role in that continuing narrative.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We really hope it's given you a new perspective on this vital corner of the world.